When successful entrepreneur Marcus Chen sat in his custom wheelchair across from his wife of 7 years, he never imagined the words that would shatter his world. "You are just my ATM. I only married you for your money." Cold, cruel words from the woman he'd loved since college. The woman who'd promised to stand by him after the accident that left him crippled. But what this crippled husband did next would shock her in ways she never saw coming, turning everything she thought she controlled upside down. How did a man confined to wheels, dependent on the wife who just confessed her mercenary marriage, manage to orchestrate the most devastating response? What secrets had Marcus been hiding behind those patient smiles and generous bank transfers? And when the smoke cleared, which one of them would be left with nothing? The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse overlooking the city, each droplet racing down the glass like tears Marcus Chen refused to shed. He sat motionless in his wheelchair, hands resting on the leather armrests, his knuckles white despite the calm expression he maintained. Across from him, Victoria paced in her designer heels, the ones he'd bought her last month, he noted with bitter irony, her perfectly manicured fingers gesturing wildly as she continued her tirade. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Marcus? You are just my ATM. That's all you've ever been to me. I only married you for your money." Victoria's voice cut through the room like shattered crystal, each word precisely enunciated, as if she'd rehearsed this moment. Her auburn hair, professionally styled that morning at the salon he paid for, swayed with each emphatic movement. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend." Marcus remembered the first time he'd seen Victoria, back when he could still walk, still run, still dance. They'd been at Stanford, both ambitious 20-year-olds, with dreams painted in broad strokes across their futures. She'd been studying art history. He'd been building his first tech startup in his dorm room. He'd fallen for her laugh first, genuine and unreserved, nothing like the practiced social laugh she used now at the charity galas they attended. They'd spent nights talking about changing the world, about building something meaningful together, about love that transcended material things. The accident had happened 3 years into their marriage. A drunk driver, a rainy night much like this one, and suddenly Marcus Chen, the man who'd built a software empire worth hundreds of millions by age 30, couldn't feel his legs. The doctors had delivered the news with clinical detachment, complete spinal cord injury, permanent paralysis from the waist down. He'd watched Victoria's face that day in the hospital, searching for any sign of the woman he'd married, and he'd seen something flicker across her features. Not quite horror, not quite disappointment, but something he couldn't name then and wished he couldn't name now. "Say something," Victoria demanded, stopping her pacing to face him directly. The city lights behind her created a halo effect, making her look almost angelic despite the venom in her words. "Don't just sit there like you always do, so calm, so understanding, so pathetically grateful for any scrap of attention I throw your way." Marcus took a slow breath, his mind traveling back 4 years to the months after the accident. Victoria had stayed, yes, but she'd changed. The woman who used to curl up beside him watching old movies became someone who was always busy, always out, always somewhere else. She'd hired nurses despite his protests that he could manage most things himself. She'd redecorated their home with ramps and grab bars, making it functional, but somehow making him feel more disabled with each modification. And slowly, so slowly he hadn't wanted to admit it, she'd begun treating him not as her husband but as her crippled husband, a subtle distinction that colored every interaction. He'd started noticing the small things 6 months ago, the way she'd angle her phone away when texting, the new lingerie in her drawer that he never saw her wear around him, the credit card statements showing hotel charges when she claimed to be at her book club. Marcus Chen hadn't built a multi-million-dollar company by ignoring patterns and data. So he'd started collecting his own data, hiring a private investigator, documenting everything. Not out of anger, not then, but out of a need to understand the woman he'd loved, the wife he'd have given everything for. "I've met someone," Victoria continued, her voice softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Someone who can give me the life I deserve. Someone who isn't—" She gestured vaguely at his wheelchair, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. Marcus wondered if she remembered their wedding vows. They'd written them together, both insisting on including the traditional words despite their modern sensibilities. In sickness and in health, they'd promised each other in front of 200 guests. He remembered how her hands had trembled when she slipped the ring on his finger, how she'd cried happy tears during their first dance. Had that woman ever existed, or had he been deceived from the beginning? "His name is Derek," she said, pulling out her phone and showing Marcus a photo as if introducing a new friend rather than confessing to an affair. The man in the image was everything Marcus no longer was: tall, athletic, standing beside Victoria, with an arm casually draped around her waist. They were on a yacht, champagne glasses raised to the camera. "He's a real estate developer. He's dynamic, he's active, he's not crippled," Marcus finished for her, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. Victoria had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that. But yes, Marcus, he can do things with me. Travel without worrying about accessibility. Dance at parties. Make love without it being a medical procedure." Her words grew sharper with each phrase, as if she'd been holding this resentment so long it had fermented into something toxic. "I only married you for your money, and I've paid my dues. 4 years of playing the devoted wife to a crippled husband. 4 years of pitying looks from our friends. 4 years of my youth wasted." Marcus thought about the prenuptial agreement they'd signed, the one his lawyers had insisted on despite his protests. He'd been young and naive then, believing that love conquered all. But his legal team had been insistent. Victoria had signed it without much fuss. Another piece of data that suddenly made terrible sense. The agreement entitled her to a modest settlement in case of divorce, nothing close to the fortune she clearly expected. "I want a divorce," Victoria announced, as if Marcus hadn't already understood where this conversation was heading. "And I want what I'm owed. Half of everything. The company, the properties, the investments, all of it. I earned it by staying with you, by taking care of you, by sacrificing my happiness." The rain continued its assault on the windows, nature providing a soundtrack to the death of a marriage. Marcus watched Victoria's face, really looked at her, and realized he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. The wife he'd loved was a ghost, if she'd ever existed at all. This woman before him, beautiful, cold, calculating, was a stranger wearing a familiar face. "You think you've been patient," Victoria continued, misinterpreting his silence as weakness. "But I've been patient too, waiting for you to get better, to be who you were. But you're never going to be that man again, are you? You're just going to be my crippled husband forever. Dead weight I have to drag through life." Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Is that everything? Is there anything else you need to tell me?" Victoria blinked, clearly surprised by his calm response. "That's it? That's all you have to say? I just told you I only married you for your money, that I've been having an affair, that I want a divorce and half your fortune, and you're just going to sit there?" "Yes," Marcus said simply. "I'm going to sit here, in my wheelchair, as your crippled husband, the ATM you married, and I'm going to do exactly what needs to be done." He pressed a button on his phone, and suddenly the large television screen on the wall flickered to life. Victoria's face appeared on the screen, but not as she looked now. This was Victoria from 6 hours ago, in a hotel room, in the arms of Derek, discussing their plans. The audio was crystal clear. "Once I get the divorce finalized, we'll have everything," screamed Victoria was saying. "That crippled fool has no idea. He's so pathetically grateful for any attention I give him. Taking half his money will be easier than taking candy from a baby." The color drained from Victoria's face as she watched herself on screen. "How did you? You're not the only one with secrets," Marcus said, his voice still eerily calm. "You're not the only one who's been planning. And you made one critical mistake, Victoria. You assume that because I'm crippled, I'm helpless. You confused my body with my mind." The next morning, Victoria woke to find Marcus already gone from the penthouse. A folder lay on the kitchen island, her name written in his precise handwriting across the front. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing page after page of documentation. Bank statements showing every cent she'd spent over the past 4 years, the secret credit cards he'd known about, the cash withdrawals, the gifts to Derek. private investigator reports with photos, timestamps, locations, and most damning of all, the prenuptial agreement she'd signed, highlighted in yellow with the relevant clauses marked. Her phone rang. Derek's name flashed on the screen. "Did you see the news?" he asked without preamble, his voice panicked in a way she'd never heard before. "Turn on Channel 7. Victoria grabbed the remote with trembling fingers. The morning news anchor's serious face filled the screen. Tech entrepreneur Marcus Chen shocked the business world this morning by announcing the creation of the Chen Foundation for Spinal Cord Injury Research, endowing it with 60% of his personal fortune, an estimated $300 million. In addition, Chen revealed he's been working with federal investigators for the past 6 months, providing evidence in a major real estate fraud case. Real estate developer Derek Morrison was arrested early this morning on charges of fraud, money laundering, and... Victoria stopped listening. The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the marble floor like snow. She thought back to every conversation she'd had with Derek over the past year, every plan they'd made, every detail she'd shared about Marcus's business holdings and connections. She remembered how Derek had always seemed so interested in Marcus's work, in his contacts, in his investments. She'd thought he was just being supportive, helping her understand her own husband's business so she could plan their future together. She'd been such a fool. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Derek had been using her to get information on Marcus. The affair, the romance, the promises of a life together. All of it had been a con. And Marcus had known. He'd known everything. Had let her believe she was deceiving him while he gathered evidence not just of her betrayal, but of Derek's criminal activities. When had Marcus learned the truth? She thought back to those quiet evenings when he'd seemed distracted, distant. She'd assumed he was depressed about his condition, too absorbed in his own self-pity to notice her slipping away. But he'd been investigating, planning, watching her dig her own grave with every careless word, every secret meeting, every moment she'd thought she was being clever. The penthouse intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Chen?" The doorman's voice crackled through. "There are some gentlemen here who say they need to speak with you. They say they're from the district attorney's office." Victoria's legs gave out. She sank to the floor amid the scattered papers, designer dress crumpling around her, surrounded by evidence of her own betrayal. She'd called Marcus her ATM, had told her crippled husband he was nothing but a source of money, but she'd been the one being used, the one being played. Derek had seen her the same way she'd seen Marcus, as a resource to exploit, a means to an end. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When she opened it, she found a single message. "I've transferred $50,000 to your personal account. Exactly what the prenup stipulates you're owed for our marriage. The penthouse lease is in my name, so you have 30 days to find new accommodations. I've already moved to the downtown loft. My lawyers will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. By the way, I never needed you to stay after the accident. I would have given you a generous divorce then if you'd asked. But you chose to stay, to play the devoted wife while stealing from me and conspiring with a criminal. You didn't just marry me for my money, Victoria. You stayed for it. That was your choice. Live with it." The message wasn't signed, but Victoria knew Marcus's clinical precision in every word. She scrolled up, hoping for more, some sign of the emotion that must be underneath. But there was nothing. Just facts, just consequences, just the cold truth of what she'd done and what she'd lost. A memory surfaced unbidden. Marcus in the hospital after the accident, his hand reaching for hers despite the pain he must have been in. "I know this changes everything," he'd said, his voice hoarse from the surgery. "If you want to leave, I'll understand. I don't want you to stay out of pity or obligation." And she'd squeezed his hand, had looked into his eyes and promised, "I'm not going anywhere. For better or worse, remember?" She'd meant it in that moment. Or had she? When had the switch flipped? When had the man she'd loved become the crippled husband she'd resented? When had his money become more important than his heart? Victoria pulled herself up, using the kitchen counter, catching sight of her reflection in the microwave's chrome surface. The woman staring back at her was still beautiful, still young, still had her whole life ahead of her. But those were just surfaces, just exteriors. Inside, she was bankrupt in ways that had nothing to do with money. The district attorney's representatives were waiting. She would have to face them, face the questions about Derek, about what she knew, about her own potential culpability in his crimes. Marcus had been careful in his text. He'd accused her of stealing and conspiring, but those were his words, not legal charges. Not yet. Whether she faced criminal prosecution might depend on exactly what evidence Marcus had provided to the investigators. She thought about calling him, begging for mercy, explaining that she'd been manipulated too. But what could she say? That she'd only betrayed him, insulted him, called him an ATM because Derek had been whispering in her ear? That she'd only told her crippled husband he was worthless because she'd been blinded by the promises of a con man? The explanation sounded pathetic even in her own mind. The intercom buzzed again, more insistently this time. Victoria took a deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and walked toward the door. She'd made her choices. Marcus was right about that. She'd chosen to stay in the marriage while despising her husband for his disability. She'd chosen to steal from him while playing the martyr. She'd chosen to believe Derek's promises while ignoring every warning sign, and now Marcus had made his choices. He'd chosen to expose her, to protect his assets, to help bring down a criminal enterprise, and to walk away, or rather, roll away, from the wreckage of their marriage with his dignity intact. He'd been the crippled husband, the one society pitied, the one she'd believed had no power, but he'd been the one in control all along. As Victoria opened the door to face the consequences of her actions, her last thought was of Marcus's face last night when she'd called him her ATM. She'd expected hurt, anger, devastation, but what she'd seen instead was something far more unsettling. Relief. Relief that he finally had permission to stop pretending, to stop hoping, to stop loving someone who saw him only as a disabled man with a bank account. She'd wanted to shock him with her cruelty, but what he did, exposing her, protecting himself, and walking away without looking back, had shocked her far more than she ever could have imagined. 6 months later, Marcus Chen sat in a conference room at the new headquarters of the Chen Foundation for Spinal Cord Injury Research. The space was designed with accessibility at its core, not as an afterthought. Wide corridors, adjustable height desks, cutting-edge assistive technology integrated seamlessly into every aspect of the building. It was everything the penthouse he'd shared with Victoria hadn't been. A space designed not to accommodate his disability, but to eliminate the barriers that made it disabling. The first round of clinical trials shows remarkable promise, Dr. Sarah Kim was saying, her presentation lighting up the wall screen. Your donation has allowed us to accelerate research that would have taken decades. We're talking about potential treatments within 5 to 7 years, Mr. Chen. Marcus nodded, making notes on his tablet. Around the conference table sat some of the brightest minds in neuroscience and spinal cord research, all working toward a future where accidents like his wouldn't mean a lifetime in a wheelchair. He'd funded their work not because he expected a cure for himself. He'd long ago made peace with his body's limitations, but because he knew there were others, younger people, children even, who deserved better outcomes. After the meeting ended, Marcus wheeled himself to his private office overlooking the research campus. The room was sparse but functional, with large windows letting in natural light and a standing desk that adjusted to the perfect height for his wheelchair. On the wall hung a single-frame photograph, not of Victoria, those pictures had been packed away or destroyed, but of his parents, both gone now, who taught him that a person's worth wasn't measured in what their body could do, but in how they treated others. His lawyer, Patricia Rodriguez, arrived precisely at 2 o'clock as scheduled. She'd been with him through the entire divorce process, had helped him navigate the criminal investigation, and had become something of a friend in the aftermath. She settled into the chair across from his desk and pulled out her tablet. The divorce is final, Patricia announced. Victoria signed everything this morning. She didn't contest the prenup terms. Honestly, I think she was just grateful you didn't press criminal charges. Marcus had wrestled with that decision for weeks. The evidence he gathered could have implicated Victoria in Derek's fraud scheme. She'd knowingly passed information to Derek that he'd used in his criminal enterprise. But ultimately, Marcus had decided that destroying her completely would also destroy him. Some revenge wasn't worth the cost to your own soul. How is she? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. Patricia raised an eyebrow. You really want to know? I spent 7 years of my life with her. Some part of me still cares about what happens to her, even after everything. Patricia consulted her tablet. She's working as a gallery assistant in Portland. Moved there 3 months ago, probably to escape the scandal here. Living in a studio apartment, no social media presence, keeping a low profile. Derek's trial starts next month, and she's been listed as a potential witness, but the DA's office indicated they probably won't call her. The case is strong enough without her testimony. Marcus absorbed this information. Victoria had gone from the penthouse in the designer clothes to a studio apartment in a retail job. Part of him, the part that had loved her, felt a twinge of sympathy. But a larger part remembered her words, remembered the contempt in her voice when she'd called him her ATM, remembered every moment she'd made him feel less than human because of his disability. There's something else, Patricia continued, her tone shifting. I received a letter for you. Victoria asked me to pass it along. You don't have to read it if you don't want to. Marcus took the envelope, noting his name written in Victoria's distinctive handwriting. He set it on his desk unopened. Maybe later. Patricia stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Marcus, what you did took incredible restraint. Most people in your position would have gone for the jugular, would have tried to destroy her completely. The fact that you didn't, that you gave her a chance to rebuild her life, says a lot about your character. After Patricia left, Marcus sat alone with the envelope. Outside his window, researchers moved between buildings, engaged in work that might change the world for people like him. He'd turned his pain into purpose, had transformed Victoria's betrayal into motivation to do something meaningful. The money she'd wanted so desperately was now funding research that could help thousands. He opened the envelope. The letter was short, written on plain paper, no expensive stationery this time. Marcus, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm writing this because my therapist says I need to take accountability for my actions, but also because I think you deserve to hear this directly from me. You were right about everything. Derek used me, but that doesn't excuse what I did to you. I told myself I was trapped, that I'd sacrificed my youth to care for a crippled husband, that I deserved more. The truth is, I was never trapped. You would have let me go with grace if I'd asked, but I stayed because I wanted the lifestyle, the money, the status of being Marcus Chen's wife, and then I wanted to punish you for not being the man I'd married, as if your accident was a personal betrayal rather than a tragedy that happened to both of us. I called you my ATM, said I only married you for your money. Those words haunt me every day, because they weren't true when I said them, even though I wanted them to be. The truth is more complicated and more damning. I did love you once, truly loved you. But after the accident, I couldn't separate the man I loved from the disability I resented. Instead of admitting that and leaving with honesty, I stayed and slowly poisoned everything good between us. I turned you into a villain in my own mind, the crippled husband who'd ruined my dreams, so I could justify my betrayal. What you did shocked me, yes, but more than that, it showed me who you really are. You could have destroyed me completely. You had the evidence, the money, the power to ruin my life beyond any hope of recovery, but you didn't. You gave me exactly what I was owed according to the prenup, and you let me walk away to start over. That mercy is more than I deserved, and more than I would have given if our positions were reversed. I'm working on myself now. Therapy mostly, trying to understand how I became someone who could be so cruel to a person I once loved. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it, but I'm trying. Not for you. I know I've lost any right to your concern, but for myself, so I don't repeat these mistakes with the next person who's unfortunate enough to care about me. You were never just my ATM. You were never just my crippled husband. You were always Marcus, brilliant, kind, patient, and strong in ways that had nothing to do with your legs. I'm sorry it took losing you to see that clearly. I hope your foundation changes the world. I hope you find someone who sees you the way you deserve to be seen all along. And I hope that somewhere in your heart, In the future, when enough time has passed, you might remember the good moments we had before everything went wrong. Victoria. Marcus read the letter twice, then set it aside. It was a good letter, honest and self-aware in ways Victoria had never been during their marriage. It might even be sincere, but it changed nothing. Apologies didn't erase the damage, didn't undo the cruelty, didn't give him back the years he'd spent loving someone who'd learned to see him as less than human. He thought about responding, about acknowledging her growth and wishing her well, but ultimately he decided silence was the better answer. Victoria needed to move forward without his validation, without his forgiveness acting as absolution. She needed to learn to live with what she'd done, just as he was learning to live with what she'd revealed about herself. His phone chimed with a reminder. He had a date that evening, dinner with Elena Vasquez, a disability rights attorney he'd met at a fundraiser 3 months ago. They'd been taking things slowly, building a friendship that might become something more. Elena used a wheelchair too, had since childhood, and she navigated the world with a combination of fierce advocacy and gentle humor that Marcus found both refreshing and attractive. More importantly, Elena saw his wheelchair the way he did, as a tool, a piece of adaptive equipment, not as a defining characteristic or a tragedy. When she looked at him, she saw Marcus the person, Marcus the entrepreneur, Marcus the philanthropist. The wheelchair was just there, the way glasses or hearing aid might be there, present but not definitive. He'd told Elena about Victoria on their second date, had been honest about the divorce and the circumstances. She'd listened without judgment, then said something that had stayed with him. She didn't see you because she didn't want to. The wheelchair was just her excuse. If it hadn't been that, she would have found something else to justify her behavior. People who truly love you see past all the surface things to who you actually are. Marcus wheeled over to the window, looking out at the campus he'd built with Victoria's betrayed money. Researchers were working to cure paralysis, to give people like him their mobility back. It was important work, vital work. But Marcus had already learned the most important lesson. His worth, his humanity, his value as a person had nothing to do with whether he could walk. Victoria had called him her crippled husband, had reduced him to a disability and a bank account. But in doing so, she'd freed him from something more crippling than the accident ever had. The belief that he needed someone who couldn't truly see him. He'd spent 4 years trying to prove to Victoria that he was still the same man she'd married, still worthy of her love despite his wheelchair. It had taken her cruelty to make him realize he'd never needed to prove anything. The problem was never him. It was her inability to see past the surface, to understand that a person's value didn't rest in their physical capabilities. What he'd done had shocked her, yes. But really, he'd just shown her the truth she'd been too blind to see, that the man in the wheelchair was smarter, stronger, and more whole than she'd ever been, walking on 2 perfectly functional legs. Marcus picked up his phone and texted Elena. Still on for tonight? Looking forward to it. Her response came immediately. Absolutely. There's a new Thai place with amazing accessibility. My treat. He smiled. A simple exchange, but one that contained everything his marriage to Victoria had lacked. Equality, mutual respect, genuine care. Elena didn't see him as her ATM or as her crippled boyfriend. She just saw him as Marcus, and he saw her as Elena, and everything else was just details to be navigated together. As the sun set over the research campus, Marcus Chen looked toward the future. There would be new treatments developed here, lives changed, maybe even cures discovered. But for Marcus personally, the healing had already happened. Victoria's betrayal had been painful, her words cruel, her actions devastating. But in the end, what she'd done had shocked her far more than it had shocked him. She'd revealed her true self and lost everything she valued. He'd revealed his strength and found himself free, free from a loveless marriage, free from someone who couldn't see his worth, free to build a life with purpose and meaning, and perhaps with someone who truly saw him. The wheelchair hadn't made him less. Victoria's inability to see that had made her less. And that realization, more than any revenge, more than any public exposure, more than any legal consequence, was what had shocked her most of all. Marcus had been her crippled husband, her ATM, the man she'd married for money. But he'd never been just anything. He'd always been fully himself, fully human, fully worthy. It had just taken losing Victoria to fully understand that truth. And now, rolling toward whatever future awaited him, Marcus Chen was finally, genuinely free. The restaurant Elena had chosen was in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, all exposed brick and soft lighting. Marcus arrived first, transferring from his car to his wheelchair with practiced ease, declining the valet's offer of assistance with a polite smile. He'd long ago learned that most people wanted to help, but the best help was often just getting out of the way. Inside, the restaurant was exactly as Elena had described, genuinely accessible, not just legally compliant. The tables were spaced with room to maneuver, the floor was level throughout, and the restrooms were actually functional for wheelchair users. These details might have seemed small to someone who'd never navigated the world on wheels, but to Marcus, they represented a philosophy. Disability wasn't something to be accommodated with grudging minimum effort, but something to be designed for with intention and respect. Elena arrived 10 minutes later, her power wheelchair humming softly as she navigated to the table. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes, her dark hair swept back in an elegant style. As she positioned herself across from Marcus, her face broke into a warm smile that made his heart do something it hadn't done in years. "You look beautiful," Marcus said, and meant it. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Elena replied, her tone playful. "Though I have to say, I'm used to seeing you in those board meeting power suits. This casual look is new." They ordered dinner, Elena insisting on trying half the menu because life is too short for culinary timidity, and fell into easy conversation. Elena had spent her day in court, arguing a case about workplace discrimination against a woman who'd been fired after requesting reasonable accommodations for her chronic illness. "The lawyer on the other side kept using these euphemisms," Elena said, her frustration evident, calling accommodations special treatment, implying my client wanted an unfair advantage, as if having the same opportunity to do your job as everyone else is somehow asking for special privileges. Marcus understood that frustration intimately. "People confuse equity with equality," he said. "They think fairness means treating everyone exactly the same, rather than giving everyone what they need to succeed." "Exactly!" Elena leaned forward, animated. "You get it. Of course you get it. It's just..." She paused, her expression softening. "Sometimes I wonder if people without disabilities ever really understand. Not intellectually, but viscerally, the way you and I do." "I think some do," Marcus said carefully. "My research team includes plenty of able-bodied people who genuinely understand disability rights as human rights, but you're right that lived experience provides a different kind of knowledge." Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Elena's obsession with true crime podcasts, Marcus's recent attempt to learn how to cook Thai food in his newly adapted kitchen, their shared love of old mystery novels. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation that made hours feel like minutes. But as dinner wound down and they shared a dessert, mango sticky rice that Elena insisted was the best in the city, Marcus felt a question forming, one he'd been avoiding but knew he needed to ask. "Can I ask you something personal?" he began. Elena set down her spoon. "Of course. Do you ever worry about..." Marcus struggled with the phrasing. "About how people see you? About whether someone's attracted to you despite your wheelchair or because of it? About whether they're really seeing you or just projecting their own issues about disability?" Elena was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Are you asking because of what happened with Victoria?" Marcus nodded. "She couldn't separate me from the wheelchair. Everything I did, everything I was, got filtered through that lens." I'm not sure she ever saw Marcus, the person after the accident, just crippled husband, as she so eloquently put it. "First," Elena said firmly, "Victoria was a specific person with specific issues. Don't let her poison your future relationships. Second, yes, I've worried about that. I've dated people who fetishized my disability, people who saw me as inspirational trauma porn, people who wanted to be my savior. All of those relationships ended badly because they weren't really seeing me as Elena. They were seeing their idea of what a disabled person should be. How do you tell the difference?" Marcus asked. Between someone who genuinely sees you and someone who's projecting? Elena smiled, a hint of sadness in it. Time, mostly, and paying attention. Do they treat you as a whole person with agency and autonomy? Or do they constantly try to help without asking if you need it? Do they ask about your life, your interests, your dreams? Or is every conversation somehow about your disability? Do they respect your choices about accessibility and accommodation? Or do they think they know better than you what you need? Marcus thought about Victoria, about how in the years after his accident, she'd made every decision about their home modifications without consulting him, about how she'd hire nurses without asking if he wanted that level of assistance, about how she'd sign them up for accessible events assuming he'd want to go, never asking what he actually enjoyed. Victoria made a lot of decisions for me, he admitted. I thought she was being considerate, taking care of things so I didn't have to worry, but now I wonder if she was just trying to control the narrative, to manage my disability in a way that was convenient for her. Probably both, Elena said gently. People are complicated. I'm sure she thought she was helping, but she was also protecting herself from having to really engage with you as a partner with his own preferences and agency. The server brought the check, and Elena insisted on splitting it despite her earlier claim that dinner was her treat. Equality and all that, she said with a wink. Outside, the spring evening was mild, the city coming alive with nighttime energy. Elena suggested they take a walk, or roll, more accurately, through a nearby sculpture park that stayed open until midnight. Marcus agreed, and they set off side by side, their wheelchairs moving in synchronized rhythm through the wide pathways. The sculptures were illuminated from below, casting dramatic shadows. They paused at each one, Elena offering her interpretations with an art historian's knowledge and a poet's sensibility. Marcus found himself watching her more than the art, captivated by the way her face lit up when she discussed something she was passionate about. At a sculpture of two figures reaching toward each other, Elena stopped and turned to Marcus. Can I ask you something personal? Fair's fair, Marcus replied. What shocked Victoria the most? When everything came out? When you revealed what you knew and what you'd done? What was the thing that truly shocked her? Marcus considered the question. I think it was realizing that I'd been in control the whole time, that I wasn't the helpless, crippled husband she'd convinced herself I was. She'd built this narrative where I was pathetic and dependent, where she held all the power because she was able-bodied and I wasn't. When I showed her that I'd known about the affair, that I'd been gathering evidence, that I'd been 10 steps ahead of her the whole time, it shattered that narrative. She confused your body with your mind, Elena said quietly. That's the fundamental mistake ableist people make. They see a disability and assume it affects everything. Your intelligence, your agency, your value as a person. Exactly. Marcus felt a weight lift, having someone who understood so completely. And the worst part was that, for a while, I started believing it too. I started seeing myself through her eyes as less than I was. Elena reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and warm. But you don't anymore. No, Marcus agreed. I don't anymore. They sat in comfortable silence, hands still joined, watching the play of light on the sculptures around them. A group of college students passed by, laughing and taking selfies, barely noticing the two people in wheelchairs who'd found a moment of connection in the middle of a sculpture park. I need to tell you something, Elena said after a while. I've been thinking about this all week, and I decided that if we're going to keep seeing each other, and I very much want to keep seeing each other, I need to be honest about where I am. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Okay. I've read about you, obviously. The divorce, the scandal, the foundation, and I've seen how the media covered it, painting you as either a victim or a vindictive ex-husband, depending on which outlet you read. But I don't know your version of the story, not really, and I think I need to, because, she paused, choosing her words carefully, because I'm falling for you, Marcus Chen, and before I fall any further, I need to know I'm not just a rebound, not just the anti-Victoria. I need to know that when you look at me, you see Elena, not a correction to a past mistake. The vulnerability in her voice was almost painful to hear. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Can we sit? He gestured to a nearby bench with space for their wheelchairs to pull up alongside. Once they were settled, Marcus took a deep breath. Victoria told me I was just her ATM, that she'd only married me for money. And maybe that's true. Maybe it became true over time. Or maybe it was always true and I was too in love to see it. But what shocked her, what really, truly shocked her, wasn't that I exposed her affair or protected my assets. It was that I didn't need her anymore. That maybe I'd never needed her the way she'd convinced both of us I did. He looked directly at Elena, wanting her to see the truth in his eyes. After the accident, I was vulnerable in ways I'd never been before. I was relearning how to exist in the world, how to do basic things differently, how to navigate spaces that weren't designed for me. And Victoria was there, and I was grateful for that presence. But I confused gratitude with love, and I confused her staying with caring. I think we both did. And now, Elena asked softly, now I know the difference. Now I know that real partnership isn't about one person staying despite the other's limitations. It's about two whole people choosing to build something together. Marcus paused, gathering his courage. When I look at you, Elena, I don't see the anti-Victoria. I don't see proof that someone can love a man in a wheelchair. I see someone brilliant and passionate and funny who also happens to use a wheelchair, just like I do. I see someone who calls me on my bullshit, who challenges me, who makes me want to be better. You're not a correction to my past. You're a possibility for my future. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's a pretty good answer. I'm not a rebound, Marcus continued. I spent 6 months processing my marriage, understanding what went wrong, working through the anger and hurt and betrayal before I was ready to even think about dating again. I'm not perfect, and I'm sure I've got trauma responses I haven't even discovered yet. But I'm not looking for someone to fix what Victoria broke. I'm looking for someone to build something new with, if you're interested. I'm interested, Elena said, and then she leaned over and kissed him. It was gentle and tentative and perfect, a first kiss that felt like both a beginning and a promise. When they pulled apart, Elena was smiling. Though I should warn you, I'm going to want to hear the whole story eventually. Not tonight, but someday. Because part of knowing you is knowing what shaped you, and that marriage, even the painful parts, shaped who you are now. I'll tell you, Marcus promised. All of it. The good parts from before the accident, the hospital, the slow realization that something was wrong. All of it. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to be here with you, in this moment, without the past hanging over us. They stayed in the sculpture park until it closed, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for future dates, discovering shared interests and friendly disagreements. When they finally left, wheeling side by side through the quiet streets back to where they'd parked, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine hope. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Board meeting moved to Thursday. Also, the press wants a comment on the foundation's first round of grants. Want me to handle it? Marcus texted back. I'll do it. Schedule a press conference for Friday afternoon. You like being in the spotlight now? Elena asked, having seen him type. Not particularly, Marcus admitted, but I've learned that silence gets interpreted in whatever way serves the interpreter's agenda. Better to control my own narrative. Spoken like someone who learned that lesson the hard way. I did. Marcus thought about the weeks after the divorce broke, when tabloids had written competing stories about him, some painting him as a bitter, vindictive ex-husband who'd weaponized his disability for sympathy, others casting him as a helpless victim of a gold-digging wife. None of them had been quite right, but all of them had been read by millions. The press conference announcing the Chen Foundation had been his way of taking back the narrative. He'd sat in front of cameras and talked about turning personal pain into public good, about how his experience with Victoria had taught him the importance of seeing people's true natures, and how that applied to how society viewed disabled individuals. He'd been honest without being bitter, clear without being cruel. The interview had gone viral, not because of the scandal, but because of what he'd said about disability and value. Being in a wheelchair didn't make me less than I was, but being treated as less than I was, that was crippling in ways the accident never was. We need to build a world where a person's worth isn't measured by their physical capabilities, where accommodation isn't seen as special treatment, but but as basic equity. That's what the foundation will work toward. I watched that press conference, Elena said now, pulling him from his memories. It's actually what made me want to meet you. Not the scandal, not the divorce drama, but that moment when you looked directly at the camera and said, I'm not inspirational for existing while disabled. I'm just a person who happens to use a wheelchair and also happens to have the resources to fund important research. That clarity, that refusal to be made into inspiration porn, that's what impressed me. Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest. That was the moment Victoria's narrative died completely, because I refused to play either role, victim or inspiration. I was just a man who'd been betrayed, who'd handled it strategically, and who'd chosen to do something meaningful with the resources he had. Nothing more dramatic than that. They reached Elena's car, a modified van with a ramp. She transferred to the driver's seat with fluid grace, collapsing her wheelchair and stowing it with practiced efficiency. Same time next week, she asked through the open window. Definitely, but maybe I'll cook for you this time. Fair warning, my Thai cooking experiment resulted in the fire alarm going off twice. Elena laughed. Now I'm even more interested. Text me your address. As she drove away, Marcus sat in the parking lot for a moment, processing the evening. A year ago, he'd been sitting in his penthouse listening to Victoria tell him he was nothing but an ATM, nothing but her crippled husband, nothing but a source of money. He'd felt the world cracking apart, felt years of his life revealed as a lie. But what he'd done in response, the investigation, the evidence gathering, the strategic exposure, the foundation, had shocked her because it revealed something she'd never understood. His disability had nothing to do with his capability, his worth, or his power. She'd confused the wheelchair with weakness, had thought his patience was passivity, had mistaken his kindness for helplessness. And now, driving home through the city night, Marcus realized that what shocked her most wasn't any single action he'd taken. It was the accumulated weight of his choices, each one demonstrating that he'd never been what she'd convinced herself he was. The crippled husband she'd pitied and exploited had never existed. There was only Marcus, a man who used a wheelchair, who'd loved unwisely, who'd been betrayed, and who'd chosen to respond with strategy rather than rage, with purpose rather than revenge. Victoria had wanted to reduce him to his disability in his bank account, but in the end he'd shown her and himself that he was irreducible. He was complex, capable, whole. The wheelchair was part of his reality, but it wasn't his identity. His money was a resource, but it wasn't his worth. What he'd done had shocked her because it forced her to see what she'd refused to see for 4 years, that the man in the wheelchair was more than she'd ever been, standing on 2 perfectly functional legs. Marcus started his car and headed home, not to the penthouse he'd shared with Victoria, but to the downtown loft he'd bought after the divorce. It was smaller, cozier, designed specifically for his needs and preferences. Every modification, every piece of furniture, every detail reflected his choices, not someone else's idea of what he should need. As he pulled into his building's garage, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would finally write back to Victoria. Not a long letter, not an emotional one, but a simple acknowledgement. Victoria, I received your letter. I appreciate your honesty, and I hope you find the peace you're looking for. What you did taught me something valuable, that the opinions people have about my worth, including my own, have nothing to do with my wheelchair. They have everything to do with how we choose to treat each other and ourselves. I hope you've learned something valuable too. Marcus. Short, clear, and final. Not cruel, not kind, just true. Because in the end, that's what had shocked her most. His refusal to be anything other than exactly who he was, without apology, without bitterness, without needing her validation or fearing her judgment. Inside his loft, Marcus transferred to his everyday wheelchair and made himself tea. On his desk sat a framed photo from the press conference announcing the foundation's first round of grants. In the picture, he was surrounded by researchers, patients, and advocates, all working toward a shared goal. His wheelchair was visible in the frame, but it was just one element among many, not the defining feature. That's how Elena saw him, he realized. That's how he'd finally learned to see himself. The wheelchair was there, yes, but so was everything else. His intelligence, his determination, his capacity for both love and strategic thinking, his ability to turn pain into purpose. Victoria had called him her crippled husband, had reduced him to the things she most wanted him to feel ashamed of. But shame required accepting someone else's judgment of your worth. And Marcus had finally, completely stopped accepting judgments that had nothing to do with who he actually was. His phone chimed with a text from Elena. Made it home safe. Can't stop thinking about tonight. Sweet dreams, Marcus Chen. He smiled and texted back. Sweet dreams, Elena Vasquez. See you Thursday for my questionable cooking demonstration. As Marcus prepared for bed, moving through his adapted space with the efficiency of long practice, he reflected on how far he'd come. A year ago, his life had imploded. His marriage had been revealed as a sham, his wife had betrayed him in multiple ways, and he'd had to completely reconstruct his understanding of the previous 4 years. But from that destruction, he'd built something better, a foundation that would help thousands, a clearer understanding of his own worth, the courage to be honest about what he deserved in a relationship, and now potentially a real partnership with someone who saw him, all of him, wheelchair included, as exactly who he was meant to be. Victoria had wanted to shock him with her cruelty, wanted him to feel small and worthless. Instead, what he'd done in response had shocked her. He'd proven that he was neither small nor worthless, that her opinion of him had no power unless he gave it power, and that the crippled husband she'd married for money had never existed at all. There was only Marcus Chen, brilliant, flawed, resilient, and whole. And that was enough. It had always been enough. As sleep claimed him, Marcus's last thought was of Elena's smile, of the possibility of a future built on truth rather than illusion, on genuine connection rather than convenient deception. Victoria had taken so much from him, but she'd also, inadvertently, given him something precious, the gift of seeing himself clearly, without filters, without shame, without needing anyone else's validation to know his worth. And that gift, born from betrayal and purchased with pain, had shocked them both in ways neither had anticipated. But only one of them had been prepared to learn from the shock. Only one of them had been strong enough to use it as a foundation for building something better. The crippled husband was a fiction Victoria had created to justify her cruelty. Marcus Chen was the reality she'd never been capable of seeing, and now, finally free of her blindness, Marcus could see himself clearly too. And the view was better than he'd ever imagined.